Can you hear me? Okay. I like a podium. Sorry, I've developed a habit, I guess. I actually had some slides, and I didn't quite work out to get them up for you, but I'm going to read off them, so that's actually why I need a little bit of space. And one of them was a picture of the letter that went out to the incoming students from the dean that had this sentence. Our commitment to academic freedom at the University of Chicago means that we do not support so-called quote-unquote trigger warnings. We do not cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial, and we do not condone the creation of intellectual quote-unquote safe spaces where individuals can retreat from ideas and perspectives at odds with their own. What I'm about to say is not a trigger warning. It is a spoiler alert. Okay, we'll talk about the difference between spoiler alerts, trigger warnings, and content warnings or notes, content notes. So the title of my remarks today is Whose Free Speech? The Manufactured Crisis Over Trigger Warnings and Safe Spaces. That's the spoiler alert. This is not the idea that this is in part a manufactured crisis. This is not simply my opinion that much of the anxiety about campus cultures and free speech on campuses is in fact a manufactured crisis. I think it's important to think about it, and I'm happy that we're doing that today, because I think it in fact alerts us to a number of things happening in our political culture. And like my esteemed colleagues, I'll put that in a little bit of a historical context, although I won't go very far back. I'll just go to the 90s, when there was also a lot of media hysteria about campuses and multiculturalism's evil twin, political correctness, and diversity, and what that was doing to the intellectual culture of campuses. So we'll talk about all of those things. So I want to just read first from the report that came out from Penn, which is, of course, an organization devoted to free speech. So the report is called "And Campus for All: Diversity, Inclusion, and Freedom of Speech at U.S. Universities," and they go through a number of cases of these campus controversies, Yale University, my home university, being one of them. One of my students is the cover girl, if you look at the report. But I just want to read from the summaries, the summary statements. Okay. It says, quote, "While free speech is alive and well on campus, it is not free from threats and must be vigilantly guarded if its continued strength is to be assured." I think that's something that we can probably all agree on. The second point, while current campus controversies merit attention and there have been some troubling instances of speech curtailed, these do not represent a pervasive crisis, in quotes, for free speech on campus. The next point, the dialogues, debates, and efforts at greater inclusion taking place on many campuses have the potential to help root out entrenched biases that have impeded the participation of members of marginalized groups. The next point, these conversations and controversies have the potential to unleash and amplify new and important voices that can enrich debates on campus and in wider society, thereby expanding free speech for everyone's benefit. Next point, at times protests and forms of expression are treated as if they are incursions on free speech, when in fact they are manifestations of free speech. And finally, free expression should be recognized as a principle that will overwhelmingly serve not to exclude or marginalize minority voices, but rather to amplify them. Okay, so that's the Penn report, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit, but I just want to say that, like my colleagues, I of course believe that the edge of learning should be an uncomfortable place. I have never put a trigger warning on any of my syllabi because, frankly, the syllabus, I guess, is the trigger warning. Well, actually, it's not. We have a real misconception about what a trigger warning is, right? The idea is that a trigger warning is going to tell you if you're going to be triggered, that you're going to be traumatized by the content. So the presumption is that whoever's reading it suffers from PTSD. I don't presume that all of my students suffer from PTSD. That's different from a content warning. Content warning is letting someone know this content, you might not realize it, but this might trouble you in ways. This might, like a book on lynching, you know that's going to be a book about lynching. But when you look at my syllabus, you can pretty much figure out what my class is going to be about. However, later, let me just give you an example from this semester. We had a suicide on our campus of one of the athletes on the track team, killed himself. That day, I was going to show a film called Hell House in my documentary film class. In that film, it's about evangelical Christians, and they sort of have this sort of, they put on these morality plays where they talk, they do a number of things, make a number of kind of controversial statements, the things that I thought might upset my students, including do an act of suicide where the person who commits suicide then goes to hell and is sort of taunted by the devil. So I sent an email to my students saying, just so you know, we're going to watch this film this afternoon, because two of the students were actually on the same track team as this person who just committed suicide. I also said, I understand if you don't want to watch this today, but I also hope that our seminar is a place where we can actually talk about people's misconceptions about suicide and mental health, and actually they all came. We all talked about it. So is that a trigger warning? I don't know. Maybe I guess that's the closest thing I've ever done to indulging in a trigger warning. But the question of trigger warnings as this like pervasive exercise that professors are engaging in is actually an empirical question. I actually went through, because of the hysteria about Yale, I actually went through, because Yale's syllabi are actually public, I actually went through and looked for any syllabi at Yale that have a trigger warning on them. Couldn't find one. So my question when I read about the statement, that the letter that went out to students at the University of Chicago, is I wonder how many syllabi at the University of Chicago have a trigger warning on them that elicited this letter. This letter is responding to. Is this in fact a problem that so many syllabi have these warnings for these students? So who is the sort of imagined student body, right, that's being warned? So I guess I think that this is what I want us to think about. I guess is what's really going on here. Who are these students? Then I of course thought of feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed's essay, which is a wonderful essay called "Against Students," where she cautions us to pay attention to the broad, sweeping statements made against students who seem "quote unquote" oversensitive. I agree wholeheartedly with the way she translates that as oversensitive being sensitive to that which is not over. In other words, these students, and usually students of color that are being demonized, are actually building on generations of student activism to change our universities to actually make them more inclusive. She says that students have become a problem because they are too sensitive. The idea that students have become a problem because they are too sensitive relates to a wider public discourse that describes offendability as a form of moral weakness and as a restriction on our freedom of speech. Much contemporary racism works by positioning the others as too easily offendable, which is how some come to assert their right to occupy space by being offensive. And of course, when we think about the right to offend crowd, who are those guys? Usually they're guys. Who are those people, right? I don't know how many of you caught this in the news, but if there's a poster boy for that movement right now, it's Milo, and he just got a $250,000 book deal. I think he's going to get a chance to get his say. It's pretty hard to get banned from Twitter. That doesn't explain it. I don't know what does. I mean, the point being that this popular misconception of college students undergirds discussions of academic freedom, college students of color in particular, as I said, that they're super fragile, oversensitive, entitled, that they can't handle intense exchange of ideas, that everything's a personal slight. I'm running out of time. Politically correct, coddled millennials, cry bullies, they just need to grow up. I'll say that I think much of what happened at Yale, luckily we're going to have a chance to kind of expand into other things in the Q&A as we go into the other questions. I'll just say this. I think that part of what happened with the controversy at Yale is that people saw that tiny viral, the garish viral version of this debate that happened on my campus, is that there's two sides, right? There's the good intellectual side, which believes in free speech, and then and nurtures sort of resilience, and then there's the bad identity politics side of quasi-intellectuals who want their hurt feelings indulged and campus scrubbed of anything that might hurt their feelings. And I think that image of a young black woman, which is a tiny slice which is not representative of the much more complex series of events and debates that happen on our campus. But that tiny viral image of a couple seconds of a young black girl who lost her temper in front of her calm white professor, the reason it went viral, the reason it caught fire and caught the imagination of the American public is because it fuses two pre-existing stereotypes together of the coddled millennial and the angry black woman. And that's why everybody thinks that they already know what's happening at Yale. They already know what's happening in all of our classrooms. They already know what's on our syllabi without even having to look. So I think what we need to think about is the instructive and often predictable patterns in who feels they shouldn't have to discuss certain topics, just as there are patterns in the types of folks that hold systems accountable to respectful practices. We have to make time and sometimes challenge ourselves to attend to those patterns. We also have to think about the right to offend crowd and who those people are. But there's also other questions we might ask. Well, something that came up in the preliminary remarks was that to say that diversity is not somehow in conflict with academic freedom might be disingenuous. Well, would we say that about capitalism? We're at a moment right now where tenure is more in crisis than it's ever been before. Doesn't that compromise academic freedom? When professors feel like their jobs are in jeopardy. I mean, there's other ways of framing the academic freedom on campuses other than we have students of color now, what do we do? So that's really what I want us to think about, is that how are we actually framing this whole debate about free speech? Is this even about free speech? Or is this a diversion? And so, I am fully committed to making campuses more diverse. I'm also fully committed to academic freedom, and I want us to try to move the conversation in a direction where we can kind of make some of these think about these things together, but also think about why are we talking about certain things together but not other things together.
Thank you. Is this on, or what am I supposed to do? Is there a thing here?